We're kicking off this brand new two-part series leading up to Easter titled Bold Step into Audacious Living. As we were talking about the series, we want to have some fun with it, and we started anchoring it into the era of the 80s. And here's the thing with 80s. For some of you, you weren't alive in the 80s, blah, 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 blah. Some of you were only a twinkle in your parents' eyes in the 80s, but some of you, you embraced all of the 80s. Ladies, I know this is true. You have pictures hidden somewhere. You loved Aquanet, and your bangs were about a mile high. Yeah, and I want to see those pictures. Husbands, if you find those pictures, send them to me, right? There was something about the 80s, the bright colors, the clothing. Fellas, how many of you peg-legged your jeans? You remember that? Some of you? Yeah, you're thinking back. When you rolled your jeans, you had high tops on. I had a pair of Reebok pumps. Oh, they were great. Peg-leg your jeans. And the 80s, music. The 80s was an interesting music generation, right? Because it was like this convergence of old and new and really good and really bad music, right? Classic rock was still making its way out of the 70s into the 80s, and then this was my era. Hair metal bands, yeah! Oh, come on, Warren and Motley Crue and GNR. I mean, I was all in. I still own to this day, it's at my house. I was playing electric guitar. I was just learning how to play, and I was trying to play every hair metal song I could, every power battle there was. And my electric guitar is this Jackson electric guitar with a Floyd Rose trim system. And you know what the color was? It was bright gold metallic. That is an 80s guitar right there. It was like, yeah, but you think about the music of the 80s. I mean, everything from the hair metal to Michael Jackson and NXS and REM and Depeche Mode, right? You had Cyndi Lauper. And one of my favorite, and I'm just going to share this with all of you, and I'm going to sing a little bit of that song with the hopes, my goal is to get this song stuck in your head, so now you'll spend the rest of the day singing this one song. I just want you to know I'm full up front. Wham! You remember Wham? Here we go. Wake me up before you go. That's all I'm going to sing. Now it's rolling in your head, right? You're like, no, later today, you're going to find yourself, you're going to be like going through the store, and all of a sudden you're going to find yourself singing that song. You're like, church. The 80s, right? There was something bold about the 80s. And so over this next 2-week series, we're going to look, we're going to have a lot of fun, but we're going to look at actual tension points that welled up within the very first church. And these two tension points were extremely messy. And if the leadership around that first church, if they didn't leverage two very bold decisions, bold leadership actions, I don't think the church would be around today. And this is how significant these two tension points were, how messy they really were. But these two bold actions, one of those tension points came externally, and we'll look at that next week. But the one we're looking at now is actually the tension point happened within the church between two groups of Christians, Jesus followers. And that tension point was so intense. And again, without bold leadership action, it probably would have stopped the church. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. Before we get into that, let me ask you a couple questions. Have you ever had a bad restaurant experience? Walk in, the host didn't greet you, or the host standing there, just never smile at you. You're like, hello. You walk in the bathroom first before you're seated, and when you walk in the bathroom, you're thinking to yourself, if the kitchen is as dirty as this bathroom, I don't want to eat here. You sit down, it takes forever for your server to come over and wait on you. The server finally waits on you. You get your order. Then when they bring their food out, the food's wrong, the food's bad, the food doesn't look right, doesn't taste right. It takes forever to get your bill. It's just a bad restaurant experience. Have you ever had a bad online shopping experience, right? You order that thing, when you get it, it doesn't look like the picture. It wasn't the right part. You were sure you put in the right part number. They just sent you the wrong thing. Or maybe it's broken, and now you're thinking to yourself, I got to send it back and deal with hopefully good customer service, but not always you get good customer service, right? Have you ever had a bad online shopping experience? Have you ever had a bad concert experience? My wife and I were so excited. We got tickets to U2 when we were living in Vegas. It was U2's 360 tour. And we're so excited. It was going to be at Sam Boyd Stadium, outdoors, 50-some thousand people were going to pack this stadium. And our tickets were really good. They were 7th, 8th row back. And we're like, these are awesome tickets to go see U2. We got there early. We got our seats. We're so close to the stage. And we're like, this is going to be awesome. Concert started, and what we realized was the name of the tour was 360. It was literally the concert where they were in the round, so people were all around the stage. So that's why it was called the 360 tour. And what we quickly realized, it should have been called not 360, it should have been called 270. And we were on the back side of the 270. Oh yeah, I saw Bono's face live once, the whole concert. It was so frustrating. Now, there was a life-changing moment. I mean a life-changing moment. Other than being frustrated the whole concert, it was this moment where Bono had all of us start singing Amazing Grace. And I'm just telling you, when you're at an outdoor concert venue and you can see the glow of the Las Vegas Strip and you have 50,000 people singing Amazing Grace, it was a moment. Let me ask one more question. Have you ever had a bad church experience? For many of you, the answer to that question is yes. I mean, the specifics around your bad church experience is different. But you've had a bad church experience. And what's interesting about a bad church experience, so many times the church is blamed. And maybe you've said these words, or definitely you've had a friend say these words to you, right? I don't go to church. I don't like church. I went to church, and you know what the church did? Have you noticed that? When people have a bad church experience, it's the church. It's a capital C church, and it applies to all churches. But what's interesting is when the church is blamed, it's not the church. In reality, it's a name, isn't it? Or two. Or 5. It's a person or group of people that created that bad church experience for you, for your friend. But the church holistically is blamed. And what's dangerous about a bad church experience is people don't just walk away from church. They wander away from God. It's why over and over again, I say the church, a gathering of people. Because so many times when the word church is used, people think of a building, they think of a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, they think about maybe lights, music, organ, guitar, microphones, the 65 minutes on a weekend, but that was never the original framework around a church. Never. The word church in the Bible is actually this Greek word ekklesia, which means a gathering of people. And when Jesus set in motion this movement called the church, it was all about telling people about who Jesus is. That's what the purpose of the church. Let me ask you another quick 3 questions. That bad restaurant experience you had, did you ever eat again? Bad online shopping experience, did you order online again? A bad concert experience, did you buy tickets again? We kind of laugh and chuckle, but here's the thing. And maybe this is your story. You're just taking a step back into church. But so many people, when they have a bad church experience, they walk away altogether. You see, the church is messy. You know why? Because we are messy. And the amazing story about the church is that Jesus chose to come for us, the messy people. I mean, that was his purpose, to come for the messy people, which is all of us. So let's try. to unmessy. That's now an official word, by the way. That's a real word. You can find it in the dictionary. It said no one ever. Let's try to unmessy our messy. Because remember, the church is blamed, but in reality, it is a name or two or five. So we're going to be looking at both of these tensions this weekend and next weekend that are found in the book of Acts. And it's spelled A-C-T-S. And what's interesting about the book of Acts, it wasn't originally named Acts. It was actually part of a 2-volume collection of writings. The second one is the book of Acts, volume 2, and it was all about the start, the launch, the growth of the church. Again, not the image we have today, but a gatherings of people across all different communities to tell people about Jesus. And the author of the book of Acts, volume 2, actually wrote volume 1, and we now know it. Again, it wasn't originally named this, but we now know it as the Gospel of Luke. And the author of Luke and Acts is a guy named Luke. Luke wasn't a firsthand eyewitness, but what Luke did, and he tells us his goal in Luke chapter 1, verse 1. He says that he came to thoroughly investigate everything, to make sure it was accurate, to make sure it was true, to make sure what people said was happening was actually happening. What Luke did was Luke came and interviewed all of these firsthand eyewitnesses and friends and family members of firsthand eyewitnesses. And all of a sudden, as he was interviewing, he realized all of this is true, and he wrote the Gospel of Luke, or volume 1. That's the story of Jesus that he thoroughly investigated. And the launch of the church, volume 2, or what we call the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 1, Luke records for us some of Jesus' last words that Jesus ever spoke. And what Jesus said to this larger group of people, people like you and me, he looked at this larger group of people and said, you will be my witnesses. Meaning, you need to go tell everyone what you saw, firsthand, eyewitnesses, what you heard, what you experienced. You need to tell everyone about me. And then Jesus says you need to start in Jerusalem, and this Jerusalem was their kind of hometown, is the epicenter of Jewish faith and Jewish culture. And then he says, and to Judea, which is a larger region. Think about it like it's like the state of Pennsylvania, or maybe the county that you live in. It's a larger region, and the Jews and the Jewish faith and culture was in that Judea region. Then he said to Samaria, that's a people that don't vote like you, don't think like you, or at the same socioeconomic class as you, don't talk like you, don't have the same life pursuits as you, post different things on social media than you would ever post. You know those people. And then I think Jesus just said, well, I'm just gonna cover everyone. And he literally looked at this group of people and said, and to the ends of the earth. It's everyone. Go everywhere and tell people about me. And so two guys, Paul and Barnabas, took these words seriously. But they didn't hear him directly from, well, Paul didn't, directly from Jesus. But over the time, when Paul named Jesus the subject of his life, and I'll talk about more of that in a moment, they took it seriously. And they started to launch what we call churches, ecclesias, gatherings of people, in all of these different communities with one purpose, to tell more people about Jesus. That's what the church was all about. And so as they were doing that, some internal tension erupted that started to get messy, and it could have got really messy really quickly. Certain people, and we'll talk about those certain people in a moment, came down from Judea to Antioch, and they were teaching the believers. And this group of certain people, they were Christ followers. They were Jesus followers. They were good-hearted people. These weren't bad people. But they were teaching something, and they were opinionated, and their voices were loud, and their voices were clear, and they were demanding, and this is what they were teaching. Unless you are, we'll fill in the blank in a moment, according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. And what's interesting about this entire statement, even though it has different words attached to it, this thought process, this thinking is still alive in our churches today around the world. It's this thinking of this. Unless you are, you cannot. For some of you, you left the church because of this thinking. Unless you dress a certain way, you cannot. I can always tell someone who's a little newer to the life of Tri-County Church, or maybe here for the first time, maybe this is you, if this is you, awesome. But they come into church with their Sunday best on. I'm like, oops. I was raised in a house with Sunday best. Maybe you were raised in a house. Sunday best, you wear your best to church. I'll never forget the first Sunday morning where my dad came downstairs and he actually had jeans on, and I thought the world was just going to stop spinning. It's like, oh, Dad, like, it's a new day, right? It was historic in our house because we were raised. You wore your Sunday best, right? Unless you dress a certain way, then you're not. Unless you talk a certain way, then you're not. Unless you abide by all of our spoken and unspoken rules. Churches have unspoken rules, right? Then you cannot be part. Unless you obey this list of what we think are sins. These other sins we're just going to ignore. But these we're going to elevate. Then you cannot be. Unless, right, this thinking. Again, some of you walked out of church because of this thinking. This thinking has been around for thousands of years. And this is what this group of certain Christians were saying. They were saying, unless you are, and here's the thing, before we put the word on the screen, two thoughts. One is a warning. Parents, we have incredible Kids Rock environments. So if you have kids, 5th grade or younger, we have incredible Kids Rock environments. And right now, in about 30 seconds, you're going to wish you had your kids in Kids Rock. But here's the thing. I don't have to explain to them what this word is. You do. Yeah. Second thing is, this is for everyone. We have to understand the gravity around this one word because we can't some 2,000 years later because our culture is so different. But in this Jewish culture, this was so important. And they were saying, unless you are circumcised. Now, when you're a man and you're 8 days old, this has one impact on your life. If you're a 45-year-old man and you have to have that surgery, Yeah, the nervous laughter, you're thinking about it like, yeah, I don't. This is a horrible church growth strategy, by the way. Could you imagine? Welcome to Tri-County Church. We're so glad you're here. Oh, first time? Awesome. Just so you know, part of our church membership and to be saved, you must have surgery. Here's a list of recommended doctors. Here is, right? Could you imagine that? Right? I'm just telling you, like that would cause a church. But they were saying, hey, you have to be. And again, we got to understand the Jewish mindset. This is what they were saying, okay? For all of the non-Jewish people, they were called Gentiles. Hey, that was just all non-Jewish people. And what this group of Christ followers were saying is for Gentiles, non-Jewish people, to become Christ followers, they first had to embrace Judaism. So basically, they would have to become a Jew first, then a Christian. And to convert to Judaism was a process. I mean, one of those was circumcision, right? That was surgery. Another one, you had to eat a covenant meal. Oh, by the way, you would have to embrace all the law, not just the 10 Commandments. There's some 613 laws. You had to embrace all the Old Testament law. There was a sacrifice there and a ceremonial washing, and the list goes on. But they were just saying, hey, for you to become a Christian, Gentiles, you had to embrace all of Judaism. And what Paul and Barnabas were saying was, no. Remember, okay, this is important to know. Paul was a Pharisee. He was a Jewish religious leader. Not only was he a Jewish religious leader, he was one of the top Jewish religious leaders. And then Jesus intersected with his life. Everything changed. So Paul understood the Jewish framework, the Jewish law. And Paul was like, no. You're getting this wrong. You don't go from Gentile to Judaism to being a Christian. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. And again, these weren't bad people. All they were doing is like, well, we were raised in this framework. I mean, lens Judaism this way. I was raised in a very certain denomination. This is just what we do. It's how I was raised. what I think church looks like, what I think church is supposed to be. So I'm just going to apply this to the new day. So let me ask you a very pointed question. Who or what, or maybe it's who and what, has the greatest influence on your image of church, on your perspective of church, on what you think church should look like? Because there is a who or what that frames what you think church should be. I've asked this question for over 25 years in church leadership. When people will make comments like, well, that shouldn't happen at church. And I just go, why? Because the church isn't about 65 minutes on a Sunday morning. That thought has been passed down over thousands of years. The church is the ecclesia, a gathering of people, gathering together to tell other people about Jesus. I ask this question. Have you ever been to a church that never talks about Jesus? Because there is a who and or a what. When you lens what church should be attached. And that's why going back to the book of Acts, the original framework of the church is so important. Now, what's interesting is all this tension that was happening in the first church. You know how old the church was at that point? 18 years old. That's all. Tri-County Church, Tri-County turns 25 next year, 2020, and we are going to celebrate and throw a party. It's going to be such a fun time next fall, and more of that to come. But we're just turning 25 years. The church, the very first church, was only 18 years, and guess what? They were already taking their former framework, their denomination, their idea of faith and religion, and already 18 years in, they were trying to apply it to this new movement that Jesus set into motion. Why? Because they had a who and a what that created the image of what they thought the church should be. Again, not bad people. We all do this. Well, for Paul and Barnabas, that tension, erupted in this sharp dispute and debate. It just erupted. And so the church leaders, hearing the tension and seeing the mess that this could make, they called the first church council. Now, this is an important moment. Not only because of what they discussed, but who was there. So we get the snapshot into this first Jewish council. Of course, Paul and Barnabas were there. And what's interesting about Paul's story, again, remember he was a Jewish Pharisee, a religious leader, a religious teacher, one of the best. And Paul actually was killing Christians and having Christians killed. Remember, this first Jewish council was about 18 years into the launch of the church after Jesus left this earth. But Paul, it was around year 3 or 4 after Jesus left this earth, is when he came to become a Jesus follower. Those first 3 or 4 years, he was having Christians killed. And think about the tension when Paul walked into this council located in Jerusalem where he used to have Christians killed. Don't you think people around that first Jewish council had family members that Paul had killed or knew someone? Without a doubt. Jerusalem was a small city of 50,000 people. Think about the county you live in. Everyone knows everyone. And this is just 14 years after Paul named Jesus the subject of his life and stopped killing Christians. Can you imagine that? Feel that. So Paul and Barnabas was at this first council. Peter was there, and it's awesome that Peter was there because Jesus looked at Peter and said, hey, upon this rock, I'm going to build my church, and Peter's there. I think it's also fascinating. James, Jesus' brother. You don't hear anything about James when Jesus was on this earth. There's one small little section in the Bible where Jesus' brothers were mocking him like every great brother does, right? Let's mock our other brothers. Other than that, James is silent. But after Jesus dies and is resurrected, everything changed for James. Now James is not only part of this council, you're going to see in a moment, that he had a leadership voice of the council. And I think this is fascinating as well, at this first church council, the Pharisees. Yeah, the Pharisees. There's two Jewish leadership groups, the Sadducees that were more politically based, and the Pharisees were more, well, they really cared about their Jewish law. They were the spiritual teachers. And now we see the Pharisees who, oh, by the way, were part of having Jesus crucified. They're now Christ followers, part of the church leadership. Get this image. So they all come together. They're all gathered. And all of a sudden, this group of Pharisees, some of them who were believers, they stood up, and this is what they said. They said, the Gentiles must be circumcised. Must. Have to be. It's the rule. We've always done it this way. We must continue doing it this way. And are required to keep the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, and oh, by the way, the 613 other laws and traditions, the entire framework of Judaism. Gentiles must embrace all of Judaism because we've done it this way. This is how we were raised. This is how we were taught as kids. It's everything we know. We must keep the tradition going. And after much discussion, Peter stood up and said, brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips a message of the gospel and believe. Now you have to understand, there's a massive backstory behind what Peter just said here. Because early on in the launch of the church, Peter was there when he heard Jesus say, to the ends of the earth, to the ends of the earth, that's all people. Peter was there. He heard Jesus say those words, but guess what Peter didn't want to do? He didn't want to go to those Gentiles. And God actually had to intersect, create tension within Peter's life to get Peter's attention and say, Peter, it's to all people. You can't pick or choose who you go to. It's a great story you need to read about. So Peter, and this council had to know this story about Peter and what God said to him. So Peter's like, hey, you remember some time ago, I was reminded that Jesus came for all people. All people, right? He goes on. He goes, God who knows the heart showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us. He did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. And then all of a sudden, it's kind of like his jab. It's kind of like Peter saying, oh, by the way, he says, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? He said, oh, by the way, he's talking to all of his Jewish friends. We've never been able to live up to the law that's been given to us. This weight has been so overwhelming. Why in the world would we want to put upon Gentiles something that we haven't been able to live up to? And then Peter said, no, we believe it is through grace, not the law. Through grace, not our tradition that we were raised in. Through grace, not the denomination that I have my roots in. It's the grace of our Lord, Jesus, that we are saved just as they are. And a silence fell over the entire room. And you know what started happening? Paul and Barnabas started telling stories about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. That's why storytelling is so important to us in our culture here. It's why every weekend we anchor a story to our generosity moment. Because stories reflect what God is doing within a person's life. And every generosity moment, we're telling you, when you excel in irrational generosity, When you take what God has given you and you give a portion back, God's going to leverage that to change and impact more people's lives. I think about Frank and Mary's story because I'll never forget the first time we sat around a table and they shared those words the very first time. They're like, we want to be a church that tells all people about Jesus. And at some point, we as a church, some 20 years ago, we stopped doing that. And with Tri-County Church, we can do this together. And it's because of Frank and Mary and another group of people that stepped up and said, you know what? We want to hand this church over to you and become part of what God is doing. When you give generously, I'm just telling you, it changes lives for Jesus. And it's why we tell story after story after story after story. And Paul and Barnabas just started telling stories of what God was doing in these ecclesias, these gatherings of people that were telling people about Jesus. And then somewhere in the room, we don't know how the room was structured, how people were sitting, but somewhere in the room, all of a sudden, James, Jesus' brother, stands up and makes one of the most significant statements that we have to hold on to as a church. He stands up and he starts quoting Old Testament prophets saying, hey, because he's talking to this group of Jewish Christians. He said, hey, all of our prophets, they talked about that the Gentiles one day would be part of this. We shouldn't be shocked. We shouldn't be surprised. It's in our Jewish text, our Jewish scripture. And then James says this. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles, for the people who are turning to God. And churches have made it so difficult for people. And James is like, come on, let's not make it difficult for all people to turn to loving God. You see, the first tension internally would have just decimated the church. And the action was a bold focus where James said, come on, church. I understand that you grew up in a certain way. I understand that you were taught a certain way. I understand that you have a framework on what you think the church should be. I understand that you have a whole lot of thoughts of what you think a Christ follower is or isn't or should be or shouldn't be and all of this. Come on, let's not make it difficult. And that's why the question you got to wrestle with, who and or what has given you your image of what church is? And that's why the book of Acts is so important to understand, to hold on to moments like this with James. And come on, let's not make it difficult. Now, James did clarify this because there was a couple areas where he said, come on, church, we got to be very sensitive about. Out of that 613 some odd laws plus traditions and culture and generational additions to it, James brought it all down and said, okay. But there are a couple guardrails let's keep in place. But remember, it's out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and he just brings it down. And this is what he brings it down to. Instead, we should write to them, this is a church, a gathering of people in Antioch, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat, strangled animals, and from blood. And most of that, except for one thing, you all are going, huh? So other than the sexual immorality, the rest of this had to do with the Jewish customs around food and the pagan worship and animal sacrifice, without getting all to it. And it was highly offensive. I mean, we can't even embrace how offensive this was to the Jewish culture. So the two things basically James says was, hey, let's not tick off all the Jews. Come on. Hey, Gentiles, we know you don't get it, but come on. We're trying to unify the church. And the second thing was sexual immorality. And I think someone in the back raised their hands like, hey, James, could you expand on sexual immorality? What does that encompass and what does it not encompass? And I think James like, you know what it is. You see, church, One of our goals at Tri-County Church is not to make it difficult. If you've ever been here and you've wondered, why do they do that? This is what I want you to anchor to. Because I just want you to know how intentional we are. We just don't want it to be difficult. We want people to walk in and experience a place that is electric and on fire. Have you ever walked into a church before and it is just dead? The church should be one of the most fun places in the world. The church should be one of those places you walk in and it's electric. The church should be one of these places where we can. Why? Because we have the hope of the world, Jesus, and we should be so excited to tell everyone about Jesus. The church should be one of those places where all people, no matter where they find themselves on their spiritual journey, find connection points. If you ever wonder, well, why do you do that? Because usually attached to that is, well, that doesn't help me. Christ followers, not every moment of a weekend service is designed for you. Have you thought about that? Our goal is to not make it difficult for all people, wherever they find themselves on their spiritual journey, to come back to God. Let me give you one simple example. Every time there's a message, I think through a whole list of people, because I get some of you don't believe in God at all, and I'm so glad you're part. For some of you, you believe in some of the Bible, not all the Bible. For some of you, you have opinions about the Bible and you've never read the Bible. For some of you, you have the entire Bible memorized. You have read what I've just taught multiple times, and probably you could teach it better than me. People all along the spiritual spectrum. So every weekend I think to myself, okay, we have people all along the spiritual spectrum, and I want to try to connect with every single person because I want the Bible to come alive to everyone. So I do things like this. Because if you're a church person and you have the Bible memorized, you memorize the book of the Bibles when you were in VBS and you got a sticker on that little form because you want to get the sucker at the end of the week, you know what I mean? Good for you, that's awesome. But for some of you, the Bible's a foreign world to you. And that's why I do things like this. This is so intentional, by the way. It's why I do things like this. You know the book of Acts is volume 2 of a two-volume compilation written by a guy named Luke. It's spelled A-C-T-S. You know why I do that? Because some of you are like, I know that, Chris. Good, high five. Again, you got your sticker in VBS. Here's what I know. There's many of you, if I would have just said the book of Acts without putting it on the screen, for some of you, many of you, because I've had these conversations, and this is not bad. You don't feel bad. It's why I love people are engaging. It's why I love when the Bible comes alive and it gets you excited to read more about it and study more and engage more. You know what I know? If I would have just said Acts without putting it on the screen, some of you would have heard this. And this Acts and that Acts are two vastly different things. Just is. Again, this is not bad to you. But I just want you to know why we do what we do. Everything. You can apply this statement to everything we do. We just don't want to make it difficult for any person to come back to God. Easter's coming up in 2 weeks. And it's one of my favorite weekends of the year. I mean, we talk about Jesus the other 51 weekends of the year, but it's Easter. But what we know is people are the most open to saying yes to an invite on Easter and Christmas. And I just want to encourage you, grab invites, post on social media, pick up the phone and call. And just know, we're going to have an incredible contemplative Good Friday service. Easter's about helping all people, to make it easy for all people to take a step back towards, face, embrace a loving God. first tension was internal. Came from good-hearted Christ followers who had a what and a who tied to the image of what they thought church should be. Next week, we're going to look at the next tension. And this tension came externally. And the bold response, these two together, bold focus and what we're going to look at next week, not only kept the church from crumbling, it's what caused the church to be a catalytic movement of people, an ecclesia, a gathering of people committed to love like Jesus loved, to live like Jesus lived, to lead like Jesus led, and to leave behind what Jesus left behind. And what did he leave behind? A legacy of people who loved, lived, and led just like Jesus loved, lived,